Slippery Bogle, a 1/1 common beast with hexproof from Eventide. That's it, that's the entire card. Still, it's a creature that's encouraged an entire deck archetype to be built around it.
I'm not familiar with the type of thing I'm seeing.
Bogle decks are well known in the Magic the Gathering community, but why? What impact has Slippery Bogle had on MTG, and how good was it really? Slippery Bogle was introduced to players in the penultimate set of the Lorwyn block Eventide on July 25th, 2008 when it rotated into the standard format of the time. Immediately, this lowly common caught the attention of players both casual and competitive alike. Back when it was released, the keyword hexproof hadn't been invented yet. There had been previous text on cards that resembled Slippery Bogle, like Shroud, but players soon realized that it was better than Shroud, as it allowed the creature's controller to target it with friendly, beneficial spells. To understand Slippery Bogle's impact on MTG, you first have to understand a little history of its keyword, hexproof. Slippery Bogle leapt from a bog and into our lives, giving us a strictly better Shroud effect, but it wasn't the first. Hexproof, true hexproof, was previously introduced on 2 green creatures in the Portals 3 Kingdoms set, one of which is Taoist Hermit, a 2/2 human mystic that reads, quote, whenever your opponent chooses a creature in play, they can't choose Taoist Hermit. It's an odd way of phrasing it, but make no mistake, as it reads, this is hexproof. That's even been confirmed by Wizards of the Coast, as they granted this card hexproof retroactively, making it the first creature ever printed with this ability. We've already discussed a little of hexproof's estranged cousin, Shroud, but for a time this keyword was the only thing players had in terms of negating a spell their opponents would use to target one of their creatures. That being said, it was much more limiting than hexproof, as you couldn't target your own creatures with your spells. But for most of the game's history, this was all players had to work with when trying to design a deck that played well against heavy targeted removal decks. The next real pioneer into the hexproof Wild West was a little troll card from Mirrodin. Troll Ascetic had the normal troll ability to regenerate, but it also had text similar to Taoist Hermit. It couldn't be targeted by spells or abilities your opponents control. Up till this card, the player base didn't have a lot of experience with this type of ability, so the community started to refer to this as Troll Shroud. As funny as that term was, it wasn't much longer until this text appeared on Slippery Bogle, and a new keyword would soon follow, when in 2012 hexproof officially became a new evergreen text in Magic the Gathering. From a competitive perspective, hexproof was like the holy grail of card text, a passive way of ensuring your opponent couldn't directly interact with your creature, was and still is very powerful. It's why you almost always see hexproof on naturally weak statted creatures, or you have to pay a relatively high cost for it. Still, with a card like Slippery Bogle, it's easy to see how players would want to try and break it, especially in Standard. It was a cheap common that, if you could build around it, would lead to some pretty quick victories. The whole idea was to try and buff the living hell out of Slippery Bogle with whatever pump spells, equipments, and auras you had at your disposal. You'd create this complete monster of a Bogle that your opponents just couldn't stop, and all you'd have to do is simply swing in for the win. That natural hexproof meant that your opponents would have a hard time keeping up with the ever-growing Bogle, and given its speed, you could possibly just run right through any other deck. It was the initial idea behind a standard Bogle deck, but it just didn't work in practice. During its standard lifetime from July 2008 to October 2009, no major competitive deck ran Slippery Bogle, not a one. This was due to a few factors, first of which was the access players had to cheap auras at the time. For Slippery Bogle to work, you need to pump it with permanent stats quickly, creating a rushdown style deck. At the time, other decks like Kithkin and Fairy Tribal decks were just as fast but didn't rely on combining a single creature with other cards. There was also a slimmer pool of cheap auras needed to make Slippery Bogle effective at the time. Simply put, there just wasn't room for a Bogle deck in Standard when Slippery Bogle was introduced. Despite not having any data points in Standard,
I get it!
Slippery Bogle would go on to make a name for itself and a brand new deck archetype as it rotated out and entered the Modern format.
What's that?
Oh, it's just
Slippery Bogle.
leave him alone. He'll tire himself out.
Reagan Sleepy.
In Modern, Slippery Bogle would go on to define its own deck simply referred to as Bogles, or otherwise known as Aura Hexproof. This deck's philosophy was inspired by the Slippery Bogle's cheap cost combined with hexproof and inexpensive auras to make very strong, hard to deal with creatures very quickly. In Modern, Slippery Bogle was joined by other honorary Bogles such as Gladecover Scout, who function just like another Slippery Bogle. In addition to these creatures, core Spirit Dancers were utilized to play off the deck's sheer staggering number of cheap auras, giving you extra card draw to ensure that you never stalled out, and being a backup secondary target for said auras that upped its power and toughness rather significantly. Though without hexproof, it just wasn't a true Bogle. Bogle being a colloquial term for a cheap, weak creature with hexproof, thus dubbing this the Bogle deck. While Slippery Bogle didn't have the tools needed for success in Standard, in Modern, there were plenty of cheap auras to make this card a real game changer. These Bogle decks typically run playsets of 5 different aura cards that cost only a single mana. These often included Ethereal Armor, Hyena Umbra, Keen Sense, Roncor, and Spider Umbra. Hitting near the top end of this deck's mana curve is the shining jewel of any Auras Matters deck, Daybreak Coronet, which for 2 white mana gives a creature +3/+3, first strike, vigilance, and lifelink, so long as that creature already has another aura on it, which in this deck will always be a thing. You can see just how quickly a creature with hexproof can spiral out of control and just run over opponents as they struggle to derive some means to remove it. The Umbras in particular really help to elevate the Slippery Bogle with their added totem ability. If a creature did manage to block and kill a pumped up Slippery Bogle, the Umbras took that killing blow instead, leaving the Bogles safe for another swing. This strategy has paid off big in major tournaments for the Modern format. The first major showing for Slippery Bogle came in 2013's World Championship, used in an Aura Hexproof deck played by Reed Duke. This deck made it to the number 2 spot and instantly put it on the radars of other professional players. That deck contained 3 copies of Unflinching Courage, which was fairly expensive comparatively to the other auras, and it would be this card slot that would change over the years as Slippery Bogle and this deck continued to be tweaked at a high competitive level. For the 2015 championship, Slippery Bogle finally took the top spot with a deck played by Seth Manfield, as he slotted in new auras to help bypass opponents' creatures, chump blocking and delaying victory. Auras like Spirit Mantle and Glaring Aegis provides a buffed up Slippery Bogle the means to hammer home a win, which cemented its status as a major deck archetype in the Modern format. Again, the Bogles deck would secure the top spot in a major tournament at GP Toronto in 2018 in a deck piloted by Dan Ward. Of course, Slippery Bogle was paired with the normal auras that have come to define this deck, but with the addition of Griff's Boon, which had the benefit of being able to be used from the graveyard, which helped counter opponents' cards that can manipulate your hand, or in the case a heavily stacked hexproof creature of yours ends up dying to a board wipe. These 2 strategies seem to be the Slippery Bogle's biggest weaknesses, the slippery slope as it were.
Oh, now I get it!
Thoughtseize could ruin the aggression of a deck by picking out key auras or, heaven forbid, removing Slippery Bogle from your hand before it can even impact the board. Likewise, while Hexproof protects Slippery Bogle and other Bogles from targeted removal, board wipe spells like Wrath of God were still very much a threat. The usual suspects of the Bogle deck again showed up most recently at the 2020 MTGO Modern Championship Showcase played by Justin Gennari. The standout include of this deck, from Throne of Eldraine, was an interesting aura that acted like a miniature Daybreak Coronet. All That Glistens gives creatures +1/+1 for each enchantment you control. It seemed to be a solid choice as the deck managed to snag the number 2 spot at this tournament, showing that Bogles, and namely the Slippery Bogle, still had the means to win in the ever-evolving Modern format. Still, Modern wasn't the only place Slippery Bogle was making waves. Pauper as a format is a really clever design to the MTG formula, which restricts the quality of cards one can use in their deck to those of only common rarity.
They said it never gave you
Mythic cards.
You don't know how to appreciate.
This ensures that the format has a really cheap investment for entry, while also resulting in all new decks never before seen at a competitive level that try to compensate for their lack of, well, more established rare and mythic cards. But because of this restriction, Pauper became the perfect format for a card like Slippery Bogle, which, if you can believe it, was only a common. Slippery Bogle and Glade Cover Scout remained as staples in the deck, but were joined by creatures like Silhana Ledgewalker, which included a way to bypass some opponent's creatures. This became way more important in Pauper, as many of the auras that gave creatures flying or unblockable were at the uncommon rarity and thus not permitted in the format. Aura Gnarlid is also a common include, adding raw power to the deck that is already teeming with auras as its win condition. The common level auras used with Slippery Bogle include familiar faces like Ethereal Armor and Rancor. We're now joined by the likes of Armadillo Cloak and Ancestral Mask. Other non-buffing auras like Abundant Growth and Utopia Sprawl were also used in the deck, adding mana fixing and card replacement while still adding stats to both Ancestral Mask and Aura Gnarlid. Pauper Bogles won big at the MTGO Pauper Challenge in 2017, coming in as the 4th overall deck. Max Forlini brought Bogles home the #1 spot during the Pauper MCQ at Magic Fest LA in 2019. And again, Pauper hit #1 in an MTGO Pauper MCQ again in 2019. Slippery Bogle, Bogle, or Aura Hexproof, no matter what name you call it, these decks still regularly reach the top 8 of Pauper tournaments across the world, showing that this format has utterly embraced this little frog thing with open arms.
Yeah, that'll show those poor.
Why are you cheering, Fry? You're not rich.
True, but someday I might be rich, and then people like me better watch their step.
Slippery Bogle, and the deck that it's inspired, are outstandingly resistant to change. So long as new cheap auras continue to be available and no creative ways to circumvent hexproof become popular, it's a card and deck design that will always see play at some professional level. New cards have come out that threaten Slippery Bogle, namely Shadow Spear from Theros Beyond Death and Kaya, Bane of the Dead from War of the Spark. Still, these cards are pretty narrow in scope, but could see sideboard includes if Slippery Bogle ever reaches pandemic levels. If you guys want to know more about Slippery Bogle and Bogle decks in general, I'd suggest checking out this article written over at Card Kingdom by Alex Katz, with supports from a famous Bogle pusher, Maria Bartholi of Good Luck High Five. It provides a lot of great information on the deck across all these formats, and I encourage you guys to give it a read, and you can find that link in the description below. Slippery Bogle is just such a fun common to play around with. To watch this unassuming frog just grow out of control as your opponent sweats to find any answer for the terror that is about to rot. It boils down to what makes Magic the Gathering so enjoyable for a lot of players. The simplicity of the strategy and the relatively low cost of a Bogle deck means it's accessible to anyone, pro or casual, allowing them to hop all over their enemies. If you want to know how good Slippery Bogle was, or is, I would just like to point out its recent promotion. In the supplemental set Ultimate Masters, Slippery Bogle has been upgraded from a common to an uncommon. Certainly a major accomplishment for Boglekind and a true indication of how much the MTG community loves the little Slippery Bogle.